So, this was a fascinating week for our E100. We read through some of the highlights, if we can call them that, of the book of Judges. Highlights, lowlights, interesting. And then also the book of Ruth. So we'll just sort of go through some background, we'll dig a little bit more into the details of Ruth, just because that's such a wonderful story. And yeah, and we'll go from here. So we read the 5 lessons we read about sort of the framing of Israel's disobedience. In Judges chapter 2, we read about Deborah and Barak leading Israel. In Judges 4, we read about Gideon and the Midianites. We read a long reading about Samson, his situation, I guess we'll just say, right? And then we read about Ruth. And I love that we joined these together, because in the whole sort of the book of Judges is more or less about an example of how this whole living in covenant community is not supposed to work. This is the trajectory of Judges. It gets worse and worse and worse and more terrible and terrible and terrible and deeper into sin and more violent and more horrific and more this downward trajectory. And the basic framing of that is this: the people are, this is not what God's people are supposed to be doing. And then that's contrasted with the book of Ruth, and this example of this is what covenantal faithfulness looks like. So Judges is sort of the national scale. This is not working out. And then Ruth is this focus in on this one family that gets it right. And in that, there is actually hope for the whole nation, which we will see as we look more closely. So Judges. The theme verse of the book of Judges, if you can call it that, is Judges 17:6, and then it's also repeated in Judges 21:25. This wasn't in any of our readings, but this is the direction that we're going. This is the thesis of the book of Judges. And this is this verse. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone would do what was right in his own eyes. Let me read that again. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone would do what was right in his own eyes. This is the theme verse of the entire book. It's really interesting when we especially read Samson's story in light of this sense of doing what is right in your own eyes. And so, but we also read it in connection with Moses and Moses' parting words to the people in Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy, what did Moses instruct the people to do? So in Deuteronomy 6, verses 17 through 18, Moses says, this is sort of some of the last stuff that he's saying to the people. You shall keep carefully the commandments of Yahweh your God, and his testimonies and statutes which he commanded you. And this is the important connecting point. You shall do what is right and good in the eyes of Yahweh, in order that it may go well with you in the land. Whose eyes? Whose eyes? Yahweh's eyes, right? Versus the people's eyes doing what is right in their own eyes. In fact, the book of Judges is the exact opposite of covenantal faithfulness. Everyone is doing what seems best to them. And the result is ever increasing and more horrifying violence. And the text actually especially highlights, and this could be a whole series in and of itself, but the text especially highlights violence against women in ever more detailed and horrendous ways. So the question could be for us, why? Why didn't they do what was right and good in the eyes of Yahweh? And we get this really at the very beginning of Judges. So in Judges chapter 2, we hear Joshua dies, his whole generation dies, and then Judges 2 verses 10, Judges 2:10, there arose another generation after them, after Joshua, that did not know Yahweh or the word that he had done for Israel. So this is a generation that is settled, or they're in the process of settling the land. They're a generation who did not see manna. They did not see the pillar of cloud or the fire. They did not see Mount Sinai. They did not know Yahweh and the word of Yahweh. And the reason they didn't know is because of a failure on the part of Joshua and his generation. And the failure we see when we read the Shema. And the Shema is the foundational text of Israel. It's in Deuteronomy 6. It's just before those first words that I read from Moses. This is the foundational text for the people of Israel. Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 through 9. Hear, Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your being and with all your might. And these words that I charge you today shall be upon your heart. And you shall rehearse them to your sons and speak of them when you sit in your house and when you are on the way and when you lie down and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as circlets between your eyes. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and in your gates. Notice how domestic that imagery is. It's ingrained into everyday life at home, with sons and with daughters. This is who you are to be. Moses and God are saying, you are formed by this foundational text. You're oriented to this as a family unit. Teach this, rehearse this to your sons and daughters. The most important catechists, the most important youth mentors, the most important teachers are parents, are our parents, are those, our uncles and aunts, are our godparents, are all the folks who are, according to this at least, supposed to be recounting the word and the way of God to the next generation. And somehow this didn't happen in this context. Joshua and his generation didn't do this. And so we have a generation that arose that did not know Yahweh. And so they enter into this cycle, this standard pattern of events in Judges. And the image, perhaps, if you've ever seen sort of a cross-section of a waterfall. So the water comes down and it enters the pool below it or whatever, and it sort of creates this cycle, almost this washing machine cycle. And the water keeps sometimes it keeps returning and returning and returning, and it never gets out of that. And those are the really, really dangerous ones if you are rafting or kayaking or whatever, because you can get stuck into it and it never spits you back out. And so the cycle of behavior and judgment in Judges is kind of like that, the bottom of a waterfall. It just sucks you back in. So the cycle is basically this. Israel sins as a people. They chase after other gods. And what we know from some of our archaeological and other historical evidence, some of these other gods, we need to be careful not to put our sort of postmodern pluralist perspective on this. Some of these other gods were all about things like ritual prostitution and child sacrifice, things like this. So this was not just sort of everyone believe what you need to believe and that's fine. No. This is Israel's sin. Israel chasing after other gods is a big deal. So Israel sins. Yahweh's anger is kindled against them. Enemies are strengthened to conquer or to occupy Israel. After some time of occupation, Israel cries out. God eventually raises up a military leader or deliverer or judge who delivers them from these specific enemies. Increasingly, the judges are military figures, not sort of judicial figures. Deborah is a judicial figure, but increasingly, judges are battlefield heroes. The judge delivers Israel from their enemies. There is a time of quiet in the land until the judge dies, and then we start over again on the cycle. So that's the basic pattern. There are a few exceptions to this, and these are actually the biggest exceptions are the folks that we read about in the E100: Deborah, Gideon, and Samson. So we start with Deborah. Deborah is the only fairly unambiguously good judge. We know that she is someone who delivered just judgments. The story says people came to her for her to render judgment. They trusted her. They trusted her wisdom. They could bring things to her. She was actually somewhat of a judicial figure as well as a military one. She wins a mighty victory over Sisera, and she helps Barak, who is one of the military leaders, gather an army. She goes with him. They win a mighty battle. Sisera flees the battle. He meets up with Jael, who welcomes him into her tent, gives him food. Sisera falls asleep. Jael takes a tent peg and a hammer, and ooh, ouch. And then Deborah and Barak sing this song. They give glory to God through this doxology. So when we read it, when we read it through, and maybe you saw this if you did, there's the narrative prose of Deborah and Gideon and the victory they win. And then there's this long epic poem that comes after that. A lot of scholars think that that's some of the oldest written scripture in the Bible, is the Song of Deborah, preserved in it. So these stories, right, are transmitted orally for a long time, and then eventually they're written down. But a lot of Old Testament scholars think that this song was one of the first things that was written down and then preserved in the Hebrew canon. So Deborah, pretty good judge overall, delivers the people. And then a little bit later, Gideon starts out pretty good. He's a little bit of a coward. He's a great big coward, actually. He needs a lot of hand-holding, a lot of reassurance, but he is talking to God. He's listening to God. They're having a conversation. He follows God and God's instructions to pare down his army. He starts with this huge army, and eventually it gets whittled down through some kind of bizarre trials and whatnot to 300 men. They defeat the Midianites, and then post-victory, he refuses kingship, which is a good move. He says, "God is your king. Don't make me your king." So Gideon has a pretty good trajectory. The one sort of problem with Gideon is he takes all this gold that his army captured off the defeated Midianites, and he makes an ephod, or an ephod, which is some sort of priestly garment out of all of this gold. And then the Israelites begin to worship that. So they don't wait until Gideon dies, and Gideon is actually similar sort of to Aaron in this, in the story of the golden calf. He makes this idol, and so the idolatry begins in his lifetime. And then still, though, Gideon lives to a good old age and then dies. Between Gideon and Samson, it's basically just this round of this cycle, repeated and repeated and repeated, and the judges change a little bit, but the story is basically the same. And then Samson is the last named judge. And his story is unique for a number of different reasons. But one of the key points for us is that there is no mention of quiet. Remember, so the judge delivers the people and they enjoy a time of peace. That doesn't happen with Samson. He wins mighty victories over the Philistines, but there's no sense that the land actually enjoys peace or quiet as a result of his action. Just sort of continued violence. And we see, so what happens with Samson? He starts out so well, or more specifically, his mom. His mother starts out as this wonderful story of revelation, a messenger from God, and she seems to be pretty pious. His dad kind of gets what's going on, but not quite to the same extent. His parents dedicate him to the Lord's service. He is promised to be a Nazirite, so he's never going to cut his hair. He's not supposed to drink wine or fermented beverage of any kind. He's supposed to set his eyes on Yahweh and will deliver his people. So he starts out with such promise. And then we get the first clue that this isn't going to go super well with his various interactions with women, and specifically the Philistine woman that he wants to marry. So he tells his parents, "Get that Philistine girl for me, for she is right in my eyes." So again, what's the theme verse of Judges? People following after what they decide is right in their own eyes. And that is basically what happens with Samson. He's consumed by his desires, mostly for women, right? He doesn't have any sense of this is something that I'm following God's will. This is this is what I want. This is what I want to do, and by gosh darn dolly, I'm going to do it. So he's consumed by his desires. He's motivated then by revenge. So almost all of his action against the Philistines is motivated by revenge, not any sort of justice or deliverance for the people. And he also has no sense of the commitment that his parents made on his behalf. So he, in his marriage ceremony for this Philistine woman, he throws a week-long party. And the text tells us, as young men in that day did. And so it's sort of the question, well, young men who are supposed to not be drinking wine throw week-long drunken parties? You know, this party thrown by God, or thrown by someone who is dedicated to God. So he was drinking wine. He was eating honey from the carcass of a lion, which was unclean. You know, we have some honey keepers or some beekeepers on here. We know honey is great. Nothing wrong with honey. Just don't try to grow it out of a cavern, you know, the guts of a lion, because that sounds pretty gross. And then his hair, of course, this is his ultimate downfall in his story, the story of Delilah. Finally, she pesters him until he reveals the source of his strength. And she cuts off his hair. The Philistines come, capture him. And then this turn of phrase, they put out his eyes. So again, this theme of eyes going through this whole book. They put out his eyes. And then his prayer at the very end of his life, after he basically becomes a suicide terrorist, more or less. That's basically what Samson is at this point. His prayer is, "Let me get my revenge on the Philistines." So again, he's not thinking in terms of justice. He's not thinking in terms of delivering his people. He's only thinking about himself and the revenge that he wants to take. The good news is, immediately after Samson, it gets even worse. So if you've ever read this is just, oh my goodness, this is even in the Bible. What is going on type of stories. So it essentially descends into full-blown civil war between the tribes. And the capstone of this story is this horrific story of a Levite and his concubine, who is brutally, it's a horrendous story that ends up with the concubine being gang raped, and the Levite doesn't protect her. The men of the city don't protect her, and she's killed. The Levite actually dismembers her, sends her body off to the other tribes, and then that catalyzes this horrendous civil war, and that's basically an allegory of the dismembering of the people of Israel as well. So it's happening on sort of two different levels, and all of this to say, this is not. We get to the end of Judges and we say, this is not what life in covenantal relationship with God and with neighbor is supposed to look like. The violence, the warfare, the very, very ending of the book is this story about mass kidnapping and rape in the midst of civil war. And all of this is tied to this sense of all the people did what was right in their own eyes. That's the last verse of the book of Judges. It's pretty grim. And we, as I said, we sort of read the highlights, if we can even call them that. But in the midst of those highlights, seeing this whole trajectory helps us to make sense of the individual narratives. That this is not glorifying violence in this text. This is critiquing it. This is saying this is what happens when everybody does what is right in their own eyes. And so the very next book in the canon is Ruth. And Ruth is this extraordinary, exactly opposite story from the whole book of Judges. This is exactly what covenantal relationship with God and with neighbor is supposed to look like. And guess what? The star of the story is a woman, and not even a woman, a foreigner, a foreign woman, a Moabite woman. Ellen Davis, who's one of my favorite New Testament scholars, says Ruth is a story of personal relationships that prove to be redemptive in the lives of a few ordinary people, and yet ultimately point in the direction of hope for Israel as a whole. The core theological concept of Ruth is hesed. Hesed is a Hebrew word that we translate a couple of different ways. Loving kindness or steadfast love are two of the most common. But this idea is covenantal faithfulness, covenantal loving kindness, steadfast love that is characteristic of Yahweh and is supposed to be characteristic of Yahweh's people. Ruth demonstrates how human relationships characterized by mutual faithfulness, characterized by hesed, sow seeds of hope in the midst of desperate situations, the exact opposite of the trajectory of Judges. So as we dive into the story, it begins with a very bleak picture, a picture of total loss. There's no food in the land. This family has to become refugees. And then while they are sojourning in Moab, the paterfamilias, the head of the household, dies. And then within 10 years, the two sons also die. And so they're leaving Naomi alone, a widow with two foreign daughters-in-law. And Naomi places the blame for this squarely at God's feet. The Almighty has done this to me. And yet, even as she says that, her actions suggest hope, or suggest that she's not quite done with God yet, because she returns to her people when news that God has given his people food reaches her. So she still has some degree of faith, even though she says, God has done this to me. And on the way, we have in Ruth chapter 1, we have this parting of the ways. One of her daughter-in-laws returns as a widow to her father's house. But Ruth stays. Ruth cleaves to Naomi. This is the same word that Genesis 2 uses when it describes the man leaving father and mother and cleaving to his wife, and a new family unit being formed. That being said, cleaving is not a sexual image. It is not a marriage type image. It's talking about bonding. It's talking about being bonded together, but not in a sexual or sort of physical way. And Naomi's response to this beautiful outpouring of Ruth's spirit, where you go, I will go. Your God will be my God. Your people, my people. Naomi's response is silence. She doesn't say another word to her on the road. She says, humph, if anything, and goes on. Stony silence. And when we see this, we see what Ruth is doing when we realize that Naomi, as an older woman traveling a dangerous road by herself, she almost certainly would not have physically been able to make this arduous journey from Moab back to Bethlehem by herself. And once, if she did somehow manage to make it there, the gleaning that Ruth then does, the getting food, likely would have been beyond her capacity as well. So Ruth is literally saving Naomi's life by bonding herself to her. And so we see then the rest of this unfolding as this trajectory, that this tragedy, where we start the book of Ruth, this terrible, terrible tragedy, is redeemed in the most unlikely way imaginable. And it's by the deliberate embrace of one's own vulnerability. And here I'm following Ellen Davis pretty closely, and when she lifted this up, and I think it makes all kinds of sense. So Ruth is, at the beginning of the story, Ruth is a widow. Her husband has died, but she chooses also to become an orphan. She leaves her biological family behind, and she chooses to become a sojourner or a foreigner in a foreign land. And these three, so widow, orphan, and foreigner, these three definitions are the three classifications or the three classical understandings of people who are vulnerable and deserve special care within the covenant community. The prophets, right? Are you caring for the widows and the orphans and the foreigners? And so Ruth takes on all three of these identities. And the story works because it is about what happens when one vulnerable person treats another person who is likewise vulnerable with chesed, with covenantal faithfulness. Naomi is incredibly vulnerable, but Ruth accepts additional vulnerability to take care of her, and so in so doing exhibits this incredible chesed, this incredible steadfast, loving faithfulness. And this extends, it's incredible, this extends when we read the text closely, even to Boaz, who's sort of the hero, one of the hero figures in this story, who seemingly has everything together. So this story on the threshing floor is, again, Ruth embracing incredible vulnerability. So her safety, her physical safety is on the line. Certainly her reputation, which seems to be pretty good at this point, even though a foreigner, people are noticing her work, her reputation is on the line. She places herself where rolling around in the hay on the threshing floor happened pretty frequently. So there's lots of debate about what Ruth actually does on the threshing floor. We know, right, that one of the Hebrew words for feet is a euphemism for another part of our anatomy. And yet the Hebrew text uses a different word for feet. So it's probably not. It's probably not as sexually overt. It's definitely not as sexually overt as some of our commentators would like to make it. It's shrouded in darkness. It's probably just the location at his feet. But regardless, she's embracing vulnerability. It's dark. He has to ask, "Who are you?" And then she has the audacity to propose marriage to Boaz, which, again, pretty countercultural. And his response to her, however, reveals his own vulnerability. So what he says to her, "You have done even more good with your latter chesed," i.e., you are coming to me, "than the former chesed," what you have done with Naomi, taking care of her. "You have done even more good with your latter in not going after the young men in their prime, whether poor or rich." So for whatever reason, Boaz is strangely solitary. He's still single. He's older. He likely would have been an object of certainly gossip, if not outright ridicule. Why hasn't anyone agreed to marry him, right? In the community. And then as we dive into what he actually does, he agrees at significant cost to himself to marry her. So the way that the inheritance works is that he's agreeing to continue the line of Naomi's husband and sons. And the other guy who could have married Ruth and inherited the property, he chooses not to incur it. He says, "I can't afford to. You do it." And Boaz says, "I will, even though it's going to be costly, even though there's vulnerability for me to do this." So what happens in the story of Ruth is about, and this is a quote from Ellen Davis, "Each tough, experienced individual in the story entrusts their uncertain future, into the hands of a now beloved other, each forfeiting the impoverished security of going it alone, each yielding to the other's wisdom and genuine need." So each one embracing their own vulnerability and yet manifesting chesed to another one who is vulnerable. And the book ends with the birth of a son whose name is Obed. Obed means one who serves. It's a humble name. Obed is the father of Jesse. Jesse is the father of David. David, of course, is the father, ultimately, as we'll read in the gospel lesson today, of the Messiah. Not the father of the Messiah. This is one of these tricky questions that Jesus asks. But David's line, right, leads to the Messiah. So what this means, David's name is literally the last word in the book of Ruth. The small acts of faithfulness that these individuals manifest to each other. There's one little family. All of this is happening in the time of the judges, in the time when the judges ruled. That's how the book of Ruth opens. So in the time when all of these cycles of violence and horrific action against women specifically, and this deterioration of the society is happening, it's sort of happening this way. Ruth is happening this way. This one family opens up the pathway of hope, not just for themselves. Naomi is restored to life, where she started out losing everything, she gains everything. But it opens up the pathway of hope for the entire nation. David. The story points to David, and it runs in completely opposite direction to the book of Judges, because in this story, people are not just doing what is pleasing to their own eyes. They're doing what is pleasing in the eyes of Yahweh. They are following the precepts of Yahweh. They, it seems like, are manifesting in their own lives this covenantal faithfulness, this steadfast kindness, this loving kindness That is chesed, which is the root and the foundation of what it means to be the people of God. That's a lot of me talking, going through this. I wonder for you all, and in your reading, in your conversation, in this today, what questions, what stuck out, what caught your attention?